The main idea today is we're going to teach you how to transport yourself from one space to another is the main idea. So I'm actually going to create a bunch of spaces here, and then I'm going to kind of show how this is going to work. So I'm going to create one space, I'm going to create another space here, and I'm going to actually label this space 1, label this space 2, space 2, space 3, oops. And so the main idea that we want to do is basically we want to hop ourselves between these different spaces. So space 1 is this like open planetary space, space 2 is this dark black world, and space 3 actually we'll just give it a different color right now. I'm going to set its haze to something else, to red. So we basically want to find a way to kind of jump between these three spaces. And we'll be doing that in VR. But before we get into specifics of how to do that in VR, I just want to kind of show you the main way to do this, the main way to script it, and using script to do this, and then we'll break it down to do it via VR. And so what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to create a button in this space, and when I press this button, I'm going to have it toggle us to the next space. So we're going to start with this, and then we'll build up from here. So I just created a simple box, and then on this box I'm going to make it interactable. I'm going to add this little attribute. And then on press, what I basically want to do is, it's in here that we're going to have it transport us to another space. And so on press, basically, how do we do that? So to do that, you'll notice that whenever we create a new space, or a camera for that matter, a new viewport is created. So when I right-clicked here and said new open space and created additional spaces in our universe, it also created these viewports. And so we can toggle between our different viewports by just clicking them here on the viewport panel. And basically, just to explain exactly what a viewport is just simply a way of telling Simmetri what I actually want the user to look through. So in this case, I'm basically saying I want the viewer to look through this particular camera in this space, and then it also applies exposure layer, and then we can also add, for instance, image filters through the viewport as well. So it's basically your composition. You can think of a viewport as your final composition. It's what's composing the viewpoint, the camera viewpoint, with some exposure settings and image filters. And so it's through these viewports that we can create different compositions. So one viewport happens to render the world through this space, and another viewport happens to render the world through this space, and another one renders it through this space using a set of filters or whatever. And so basically to transport ourselves between different spaces, we just need to switch out these viewports programmatically. So I'm just doing it by clicking it here, but we're going to be doing this programmatically. So back to our cube that we made interactable, and on press, so we're going to make it so that when we click this cube, we're going to switch to a different viewport. So how do we actually change the viewport programmatically? Well, what's actually happening when we change viewports is if we go to the universe, you'll see that, and we click on displays, we always have a master display. Anytime we create a new universe, we start with this thing called the master display. And if we click and view the properties of the master display, we'll see here that is where we set our active viewport. So you can kind of think of the master display as the thing that determines what gets from Simmetri out to your physical displays. So in this case, our physical display is the monitor that I'm looking at the screen right now, and it's through here where we set the viewport that we want to currently render at. So if I literally just take this second viewport and just drag and drop it here, you notice that it switched out the viewport. And if I take the third one and drag and drop it here, it switched out that viewport. So actually, that's all that's happening when I click on it. It's just setting the master display's active viewport to whichever one I'm clicking on. So this is what we need to set programmatically, this active viewport. Okay, so now that we have all that knowledge, I'm going to go back to the cube, and I made it interactable by adding this interactable attribute, and then I clicked on the on-press event. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say get universe. This is a global function you can call from any function from anywhere in Simmetri, and what it basically does is it returns an object, and I'm going to hit F1 on it so we can see what it returns. This function get universe returns this universe, which has the following functions on it: get player control, get master display, which is what we want, and get the timeline. This is our global timeline. But we're interested in this case with the master display. That will return this object right here. We could also have drag and drop the master display into our script as well. Is another way to do it, but I prefer showing this way because it's a little bit more elegant, I think, than drag and dropping it in. So I'm going to say get universe, get master display. So now that returns this object here, and so it returns an object with these properties, and we're just going to set the active viewport property. So generally the way you can think of it is any property that you see here, you can just set by removing all spaces from the properties and just lowercasing the first letter. That's basically the mapping between the properties that you might see here and their script equivalents. We can also hit F1 on get master display, which gets us our documentation. This thing returns a display. Click on display. This thing has the following methods, the following functions. It actually inherits from viewport mixer, which has our actual properties, and this is what we're setting here, the active viewport. Which if I click, here it is, the active viewport. This is what we're actually setting here. So we're going to set this equal to whatever we want. And so in this case, I'm going to create another line above it, and I'm just going to take the other viewport the viewport we want to teleport ourselves into. I'm just going to take it and just drag and drop it into here. So I just took the little icon next to space 2 viewport, and I just dragged and dropped that into onto the script above here. And now, since this thing, since the master display.active viewport, it wants a value to be set is equal to, and I'm just going to set it equal to space 2 viewport. So now basically what happens when I click this, it's going to find this space 2 viewport, which is this, and it just programmatically assigns that property on the master display to that viewport. So let's see what happens when we hit play. I'm going to click this, and voila, we're now in this space. And so I'm going to just double click on this space. I'm just going to fill this space with stuff. I'm going to make this space a spherical based space. So I'm just going to put a bunch of spheres all over the place, just to kind of fill this visual, this world out, so we can kind of see where we are with respect to other worlds. And actually, I'm going to mess around with the properties of this here, this material. I'm just going to make this material. I'm going to make it alpha blended. Actually, I'll make it additive. So additive, and then additive is interesting because they kind of have these interesting overlap kind of properties. So I'm just going to kind of do this, and just do this. Just making copies by pressing Alt. Actually, before I forget here, let me turn on those input callouts. I'm just pressing Alt basically as I drag this object, just to fill out the space, do something interesting in it. Okay, that's pretty good. And all these have physics too, so as soon as I hit play, it does that. Well, that's fine. We'll leave it like that. So space 1 is some weird red world. Space 2, when we hit play, teleports us into this weird sphere world. And then maybe in here, just to complete this simple example here, I'm going to create a button in here that when we push this, it's going to transport us into the next world, to the third viewport. So again, all I'm going to do is I'm going to go into here. I'm going to add an interactable attribute. And then on press on this attribute, I'm going to just make it do something. And in here, I want it to transport ourselves to space 3, this viewport. So I'm just going to grab this icon, drag and drop it into here. That's a representation in script of that object, the space 3 viewport. I'm going to say get universe, get master display dot active viewport is equal to, in this case, space 3 viewport. So now when we click this button, if I hit play, it's going to transport us into this third space. And in this third space, I'm going to stick, we'll make this a cone-based world here. So cones, lots of random cones. And we can import stuff from blocks too, and maybe we'll do that a little later. So I'm going to just zoom out. I'm just actually going to zoom. I'm going to hold down Control, and I'm going to mouse wheel. This is going to allow me to speed up the camera. So as I hold down Control and mouse wheel, I can change the camera speed. So now the camera moves much faster, which is useful in this case. And I'm just going to hold down Alt, make some copies of this, hold down Control to rotate. Okay. So now in this world, we have a bunch of cones. Very exciting world. I'm going to slow the camera back down. Okay, so back to space 1. I'm going to hit play. Here we are in this space. La la la. We're looking around. Click on this button. Now we're in this space. We can look around here. And then I'm going to click this button, and now we're in this cone space. And those two cones have kind of weirdly fallen over. There's no gravity in here. So there we go. So we can now know how to transport ourselves into different spaces using script. So now this script, another way we could do it, for instance, is create a trigger plane. And I'm just going to create a box in this case. And so using the same exact technique, we can make it so that when the camera moves into this box, it can call some trigger, some script can get called, which can do the same little trick here. And so same thing. Let's say we move into this box. I want us to transport into space 2 viewport. Just drag and drop that in. And on enter, we're going to say get master, get universe, get master display dot active viewport is equal to, in this case, this Space 2 viewport. Now the only other thing you have to do is the camera by default, if we click on the camera properties here, it is not what's referred to as trigger activating. It means the camera won't activate this trigger until we explicitly tell it to. So objects, for instance, that we draw, and I'll show you here an example. If I draw this box here, you'll see if you look at the properties of it, it has this property called trigger activating, which means it can activate the script that calls the trigger. By default, the camera does not, so we'll just have to add it. So I'm just going to go and hit the camera tab here. I'm going to click this little arrow here, and I'm just going to select trigger activating. And now the camera, when we hit play and we go through that, will activate this trigger. So I'm going to go through here, and we're transported into this world. And in this world, I have to click this with the laser or the mouse, and then that puts us in this world. So now we have two different ways of transporting us to these different spaces. And so now what we want to really do is do this in VR, basically. So the idea is that the user is flying around, and then there's this magical thing that they're going to fly into, and then that will magically transport them to a different world, which is kind of cool. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting ideas that we could do around this. We could maybe have them walk into a doorway that's all dark, and then you're in this like enclosed space, and then when you walk out of that enclosed space, you realize, oh, it switched out from under me, but I've actually been transported to a different world. Kind of interesting. I think there's a lot of kind of neat concepts around that. And so let's go ahead and do that. So we've created our three spaces here, and if you join us a little later, to create a space, all I did is just right-click in here and just set new open space or new terrain space. So that's how we create different spaces, and then those create viewports. So let's go ahead and add in this space a VR rig. So I'm going to click on VR AR, click on VR rig preset, and it's going to create our standard VR rig that has our lasers and all this other stuff. I'm just going to position this over here. And so now this is active. When I hit present, it puts us looking through that. And so now we'll be able to move this around and then transport us into this. So just like we did with the camera, we're going to have to set up make this trigger sensitive. So in this case, we can choose to make either the camera trigger sensitive, maybe our hands are the ones that are going to be trigger sensitive, or maybe it's the VR rig node itself. Let's just make the camera trigger sensitive. So when we poke our head in, it's going to cause it to trigger, to transport us. So I'm going to click on the HND camera that lives under the VR rig here on here, and I'm just going to make this trigger sensitive. So now when we poke our head in through this trigger, it will transport us into the other space. So now we have this camera in here that we'll be able to, in VR, move around. And now in space 2, we're going to want to do the same thing. We're going to want to create a VR rig here, which will represent our entry point in this space. So I'm going to do this. I'm just going to create a VR rig. And again, I'm going to make its camera trigger sensitive. So I'm going to click on the HMD camera. I'm just going to make it trigger sensitive, trigger activating, sorry. And so now it will cause a trigger to happen. And again, I'm going to actually build another trigger, just like we did in the first space, instead of it being a box. Actually, in this one, we'll laser over this using the camera. It might be, that's fine. Maybe this is like a magical button that transports you. We can label it. I'm going to go create some text here, and I'll stick some text here. And this text will say, click for click to transport. Click to transport. So we'll move that somewhere near this box here. So that one we have to just interact with using the laser to make that happen. And I'll make this a little smaller here. Okay, that's fine. And then our third space, who knows? Maybe this lets us get back to the first space. Maybe when we do something, maybe. So I'm gonna again create a VR rig in this space preset. And this one we can figure out at the end what to make this what will happen when we click on this VR rig. So the other thing we want to do is, so the way it's going to work now is when I hit the present button, it's going to kind of make us embody the VR rig of the current viewport we're looking through. So if I look through this viewport and I present, it makes us look through this viewport. If I click on this one, it's going to make us look this viewport. So we're going to always start here. But the thing that you have to be aware of is that even though these VR rigs live in these other spaces, they're still active. So in other words, it means that as I move my head, they're actually going to get moved in all three spaces. And we don't want that. We want them to all be deactivated and only make sure that this one's activated first, and then these other ones are deactivated, and until we teleport into here, and then we'll activate ourselves and then deactivate the other VR rigs. This is important because if we don't do that, then these will be moving around in the space as well as we fly around, causing them to trigger things in this space which we're not even looking out of. So we have to make sure we deactivate them. So I'm just going to pre-select the VR rigs and just set them active to false. That will deactivate their inputs as well. And do the same thing in space 3, the VR rig we just created. I'm going to go ahead and set active to false on that as well. So now we know that just this one's active, and as we move our head and all that stuff and we fly around, the other ones will stay put until we decide that they should be active. Okay, so now we have our triggers activating thing. That's gonna I'm gonna delete this button that we originally created because we only have one way now to actually move into this world. And I'm gonna create a little container so we can see our trigger. Because remember, this is just a helper object. This pink box here is only something that we can see in the editor. We don't see it when we present. So we're just gonna have to create an actual, like, something that we can fly into. And so what I'm just gonna do is I'm just gonna create a tube. I'm gonna just drag that out, and then I'm gonna extrude this out, and then I'm gonna just mouse wheel it down to a shape here, and I'm gonna make like a little tunnel here. And then I'm just gonna rotate this, put this kind of on the ground here, and then kind of make this fill this. I'm just gonna resize this via its properties here until it kind of fills this shape that we've created here. That should be good. So now this is our magic portal that we have to fly through. So when I present now, we can see, oops, I'm gonna make this thing not movable. I'm going to select it. By default, things are movable, so they physically kind of move around. I'm going to go to the rigid body of the property, set movable to false. So now, when I present, we know we just need to go through here to kind of teleport us. Okay, so now we have that set up. So the other thing we're going to do is we're going to go and modify the code that we originally wrote. Remember, this was setting us to this viewport here, which is not what we want. We want it to teleport us to the viewport of that camera. So in this case, and the other thing we're going to have to do, because by default they're all called HMD cameras, we're going to give them a name so that we can identify them a little bit better. So again, I'm just going to go, so again, anytime you create a camera, or a VR rig in this case, viewports are created for them so that we can actually look the world through them. And so just like we started off with the 3 default space cameras, when we created those VR rigs, it created additional viewports for them. So I'm just going to name the cameras in each one of these things so we can identify them. So again, I went back into this first viewport, and I'm just going to set the HMD camera to space 1 camera. And you'll notice that when we do that, it also renames the viewport to space 1 camera viewport. I'm going to do the same thing in the second one. I'm going to call this thing space 2 camera, and I'm going to do the same thing for the third one as well. Call this space 3 camera VR rig, HMD camera. This thing is going to be the space 3 camera. So back to the first space where we start off. We basically want this thing to basically, when we go through here, we want it to transport us not to space 2 viewport, because that was this one. We want it to go to that VR rig camera, which is the space 2 camera viewport. So that's the one we're going to drag and drop in here. So I'm going to remove this, the original space viewport, and just drag and drop in space 2 camera viewport. That's the viewport through the HMD. And I'm going to set that equal to that instead. And the other thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to disable the VR rig from this space, so this thing stops flying around. So I'm just going to literally just take that VR rig in this space, and I'm just going to drag and drop that into here, and I'm just going to set its active property of false. So that will disable our controllers. That will disable this VR rig, which in turn will also disable its controllers. And so that's what we want. And then what we have to do on the new space is we're going to have to enable its VR rig. So we can think of this as VR rig space 1. This is just the name of a variable. We can make this whatever we want. This is what actually returns that object, and then it stores in a variable. So I'm just going to rename that to space 1. So it gives it the name of VR rig by default, and we just to make it easier to identify. So we're going to disable VR rig space 1's VR rig is going to be disabled, and then we're going to have to enable VR rig space 2's camera. So again, I'm just going to, without closing the scripting window, I'm going to go into space 2. I'm going to find that camera that lives in here. Sorry, the VR rig of space 2, and I'm going to activate it. So I'm going to just drag and drop that in here. And I'm going to say VR rig space 2 dot active is equal to true. So now when we teleport into here, what's going to happen is the script is going to go ahead and activate this, and then we're going to be looking through here, and tracking will be enabled, and then we'll be able to fly around in this space without the original space, and then this will be deactivated, so this will stop triggering this. Because or else, as we're flying around, if this was tracking as well, then this could end up re-triggering this, even though we're looking through the other space, which we don't want. So by deactivating this, that will ensure that doesn't happen. Okay, so it's space 2, we do that, and then again, I'm going to edit our button here that when we click it, it transports us to the third space. Just going through the same process that we did here, we're not actually going to transport ourselves to the Space 3 viewport, but we want to transport ourselves to the Space 3 camera viewport. That's like the HMD's perspective. So I'm going to go to, so for this button, I'm going to go ahead and delete this. I'm going to find that third viewport for the HMD camera from that third space. I'm going to set it equal to that, and then we're going to, again, disable our VR rig from this space. So I'm going to find it. I can drop that in here. This is VR rig space 2. Active is equal to false. This will disable us here. And then we're going to enable us in that third space. So again, I'm going to go to the third space here from the third viewport. Find that VR rig. I'm going to drag and drop that into here. This is the VR rig space 3. Active is now equal to true. Okay, so going back to that first space, this is our starting space. When this thing flies into here, it's going to call some script, which will set the active viewport of our master display. This is the main display that we're experiencing the world through, like our headset or on screen. It's going to set that to Space 2 camera viewport, which is the perspective of the VR rig from Space 2. It will set its state to active. It will disable, the original VR rig of the original space we came from. It'll disable it so it stops moving around in the space as we move around, and then it'll activate this second VR rig so that we can then actively move around until we click on this box here, which will also, which will then, in turn, transport us to the third space. Same thing. That third space viewport, which is this perspective here, will be activated via this. It's the active viewport, so the master display is set to that, and then we're going to deactivate ourselves. That's the one we're coming from, and then we're going to activate the one we're going to, the rig of the one we're going into. And so the last thing I'm going to do is deactivate the VR rig here. I noticed that that was still active, so I'm going to set that to false. Back to the first space, into VR mode, and let's see what happens. Let's present. And so now I'm going to fly around here. Actually, sorry, Oculus is in its... Oculus is not showing. Let's see, 1 second. Okay, so we're going to switch to our viewport, and notice that this viewport doesn't have the same image filters that this. We didn't add those image filters to this one, so it's back to normal. So we could also add those image filters to this viewpoint, which is the image filters of the VR rig. So I'm just going to add a gradient map to this. I'm going to set this to 5 point. So now this perspective has that. Okay, so I'm immersed, and I can fly around here. So I believe I can fly around. Let's see here. Okay, so I can fly around, and so we're going to go. So I fly around by using the trigger of the left hand. So I'm going to fly into this thing here, and now I'm in this world. So this world, I can fly around, look at these orbs here, very mysterious. And then it says click to transport. So I'm like, what is this? What does this do here? And now I'm in this cone world here. And so we now have a kind of a nifty way to kind of transport ourselves to these various kind of domains. So we can keep kind of building up on this example. I think a cool thing to do is to put you in this dark space. Is kind of a neat way to do it. So that maybe, again, you go in and you don't see it. But actually, what I'll show is one other way to transport ourselves, and that is to use a timeline. So let's say we enter the third space, and we want to make it so that this third space, maybe you only have a few seconds. It's like, you only have like 5 seconds or 10 seconds to experience this world, and then it jumps you back into the first space. So now we have like a closed circuit, closed kind of loop situation. So to do this, what I'm going to do is, when we're in the third space here, I just double-clicked on it, and we're essentially looking through that default viewport that it creates for that space. And again, we have the HMD one, and we have the third space, the default viewport. You'll notice that by default, the timeline is editing its timeline. So every space has a timeline. So I'm just going to create a new script track. And so the script track is going to allow us to do something after a certain amount of time. So basically what we want to do is maybe give us 5 seconds, and then after 5 seconds, we want to transport ourselves back to the original space. So just like we did before, I'm going to take that original space, HMD viewport, I'm going to just drag and drop that into here, and I'm going to, again, do get universe, get master display, dot active viewport is equal to this. This is the original HMD display for that viewport. Again, we have to do that little activation thing so that we disable ourselves. So I'm going to disable my own VR rig. This is VR rig space 3 dot active is equal to false. And then we got to go back and re-enable it from space 1. So space 1, VR rig, drag and drop it into there. We're still in the script for that space 3. VR rig dot active is now equal to true. The other thing is we might want to maybe move this back because it's going to be inside the box. Well, that's okay. It'll be inside the box. You'll have to then exit and re-enter to refly into it. So then after 10 seconds, that will enable us. Now, the other thing you have to be aware of is that by default, all space timelines are active. So as soon as we hit play, the universe will activate all the timelines of all 3 spaces. So that you can think of each space's physics simulation and any other animations will be going on in the background. So we have to explicitly tell it not to animate space 3's timeline. We want to make sure that this thing's deactivated, and then we'll activate it when we first teleport into this space. And so to do this, we're just going to click on this when we're inside space 3 and we're editing its timeline. I'm just going to click on the space 3 timeline, this little link up here, and it shows the properties of that timeline. And I'm just going to set active to false on that timeline. So in this way, when we hit play, this timeline will wait until we teleport in here, and then it'll hit play. And by the way, this is a good way to do a little, if you have physics simulations going on in lots of different spaces and you transport yourself between them, by controlling the active state of that space's timeline, you can ensure that physics isn't occurring, so your simulations aren't running, and that can save a lot of processing power if you have a bunch of different spaces and you don't want physics to run until we're inside those spaces. So by turning this on and off programmatically, you can also control that kind of performance issue where okay, physics won't run until I say so by activating this timeline. So what we're gonna have to do now is basically activate this timeline when we enter. And then what we can do is when we leave this space, we can also rewind and then deactivate this timeline. So let's go ahead and do that first. I'm going to go back into that script for this time event that's going to send us back to that first space. And I'm just going to say self get parent. That actually returns the timeline itself. I'm going to rewind it, so it's going to go back to the beginning. And then I'm just going to deactivate that timeline. So what this is doing, so again, self is the script track, this track object itself, and its parent happens to be the timeline, the timeline object, which has these type of properties and has certain methods, like rewind is a method on it. I'm going to hit F1 on it so we can see that. The timeline object has the following methods: get time last and last tick, get playtime, set playtime, and it also has this rewind function, which is what we're going to call. And so we're going to rewind ourselves. It's going to play. Once we enter this space, what's going to happen is this is going to start playing, and after 5 seconds, it's going to call this code, which is going to transport us back to the original space. Then this is going to jump back to the time 0, and then we're going to deactivate ourselves, which will stop playback, basically. And so it'll wait until we come back in here, and then it'll get reactivated. So the other thing we have to do is we have to go back into space 2, and we have to go edit this code to activate that timeline. And there's other ways we could organize this code so that it might be nicer to put all the code that manages activating that timeline somewhere inside the third space. But for purposes of today, we'll just put all the code here. So again, I'm back in space 2 in that button that transports us into space 3. And in here we want to activate space 3's timeline to ensure that starts. So I'm just going to hunt for that space 3 timeline. So I'm just going to click on space 3 here. This is browsing space 3's contents. Click on timeline. That's the timeline that we're dealing with. That's its timeline that we have that script that lives on it. I'm just going to drag and drop that into here, and I'm going to set active equals to true. So that will then start playback. So it's false right now. That's the same timeline as what this thing returns here when we're in space 3. So then that will start playback. So we'll transport into here. It will start playback, and then when it reaches 5 seconds, it'll transport us back into the original space. So I'm going to jump us back into the original HMD viewport of space 1. I'm going to go back into VR mode, immerse ourselves, and see if this works. So I'm flying around, like, hey, what's going on here? What is this thing here? This kind of looks interesting. And we go in here, and puts us in this space. Like, oh, that's weird. What's going on here? What are these weird orbs? And I'm going to go here. I'm going to interact with this thing, and oh, that's cool. I'm in a new space. I think I'll just hang out here for a while. And after 5 seconds, I'm back in this original space. And so it's like, oh man, so we can go and try it again. Maybe there's a puzzle that you have to solve in 5 seconds. So you're like, oh, okay, there's some clue in here that I got to discover. And then I only can, once I figure that out, I can go into here, but I only have 5 seconds to apply that clue. That's one idea here. And then, I ran out of time. And actually, in this case, I actually went back through the trigger on the first space. So I'm going to give it 5 more seconds here. Okay, so we're back here. So that's why it's important to also disable this, because if we don't disable those VR rigs, this will stay active even as we're in the other space. And so now we have this kind of way to kind of like, oh, I only have 5 seconds in here. Got to do something quick. Oh no, I didn't. No, that was too slow. And so it's kind of a fun kind of little mechanic that we can kind of, there's all sorts of creative possibilities around that that we can kind of go to. One other thing I can show you is a way to do transitions. So right now it just kind of does this hard transition. It just kind of warps us. What if we want to do a crossfade, or we want to do a fade to black? How would we do that? So for that, those properties live in the display. So again, if we go to the universe and we find that master display, it was this master display that we were changing out the active viewport. That's the one that we're currently viewing. But we can also set transitions here. And the way to do that is I'm going to push this little play button here next to visual transition. And you can select some built-in ones here. So I'm going to do a crossfade. And when you do that, you'll see that it changes the active effect to crossfade. And you can specify the transition time. So we can do like a 2-second transition. And so now when we transport ourselves in, the transitions will not be hard now. They're not going to be cuts. They're going to be crossfades. Let's see what happens. And there we go. A little weird. Probably not what you want in a teleporting kind of case, but is interesting nonetheless. After 5 seconds, and we're back into this world here. So that's yet another way we can kind of think of that. So this lesson was short and sweet, but that's the main idea. This is kind of how we can think of transporting ourselves. So the very important takeaway here is the master display of the universe. So anytime you create a new universe, there's always a master display, and it's in there that we are changing out the viewport. So that's where we're setting the viewport that the viewer is looking through. And we can also keyframe this, by the way. So I can just show you very quickly. I can create a new key track on this. Creates a track on this initial space timeline. These are basically saying I will switch to these viewports, and we can just drag and drop them also to here, and it's going to now animate these viewport changes on a timeline, which we don't want. So but if we did, when we hit play after, it would switch out to those viewports, which I just dragged and dropped in space 1 viewport. Now this is space 2 viewport, and then it animates to this one. So that's another kind of way to think of switching out viewports, is you can just animate this on a timeline track. So we don't want that, so I'm going to delete that. I'm going to delete this track here. Another thing we could do, for instance, on this, I'm just showing you lots of different ways to switch out the viewports here, is you'll notice that not only can we create a new key track, we can do this thing called the picking controller. And if we do that, this thing wants a sample set. And so to do this, we can create, we right-click inside our universe, and I'm going to create a new sample set. And then if I view the properties of this sample set, hitting this little plus button, I can now add a bunch of different samples here. And in this case, these would be viewports. So I can say this, and then I can do this viewport, and then I can do, I clicked on the viewport. I can do this viewport, and then maybe I can do this. I can select a bunch of viewports for my sample set. And then what it's going to do, the picking controller back here at the master display, if we go back to the master display, you'll see that this picking controller, we apply that sample set here. And what it's going to do now, and we've got to create a pulse for it, so we've got to create a pick pulse. So now on some rate, at a constant pulse, so every second, it's going to go into the sample set, pick one of those viewports, and assign it. So now this is like an automatic camera switcher. So if we hit play here, you'll see every 1 second, it's going to choose a new viewport. So it chose that one, and it went to this one. So yeah, another way that we can kind of create automation and animate those kind of parameters. So again, I'm going to share this show, so I'm going to remove this for now, but that's just yet another way we can kind of switch out viewports. So just be aware that master display, that viewport that we're setting here, this is the primary way of controlling which space, which camera angle we're looking through, all that stuff, because we're using it to set these viewports that we're doing here. So that wraps up this lesson. Any other questions, please hit us up in Discord. And actually, we had some requests, so we're going to start another live stream in a few seconds. But please give us, let us know in the Discord channel, and we're happy to show you guys anything. And by the way, if you're viewing this outside of our live tutorials, you can join our Discord channel by going to the Learn menu and selecting Join the Simmetri Discord server, and that will join. You'll enter our server where we'll be able to chat with you guys about anything you might be interested in. So I'm going to share this show up to Steam right now, and I'll post a link to the Discord channel. See you next time.